When we're recording, we're on, are we?
We're on. We're on. Thanks,
Excellent,
Colin.
great. Thanks very much. Right, thanks, Catherine, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here to speak with you all. I'm really delighted to talk about something I'm quite passionate about, which is immigration pathways for international graduates in Ireland. As Catherine had said, I've kind of trying to go through the whole immigration pathway for people who are currently here and what maybe to be looking out for in order to sort of help with your future employability in the country. I do have a frequently asked questions slide at the end, but I'm also happy to try and pick some up as we go if we can. And certainly I intend to leave some time at the end. As I said, I hope to take about no more than 45 minutes going through the slide deck that I have at the moment. So just a quick little bit about myself. I'm a director with Fragomen here in Dublin. I've been working in the Irish immigration field now for over 10 years. I actually have a background in human resources and global mobility, and so became passionate about immigration through the work that I did in previous companies and helping to hire international students and international assignees coming to Ireland on the back of various different permissions. And Fragomen ultimately set up their offices as a global law firm, set up their offices in Ireland just over 7 years ago now, and we've gone from strength to strength here, and that's been largely on the back of the success of a lot of our clients who are broadly multinationals. Obviously, Ireland has a very significant EMEA base for many, many companies around the world, of which Fragomen in Ireland serves a lot of them. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to give you guys some useful bits of information about the kind of things you need to be looking out for when immigrating and remaining in Ireland to continue your education and indeed your start your professional careers or continue your professional careers. So a little bit of information about what I'm going to go through today. I'm going to give you guys an intro to Irish immigration. Many of you will have been through immigration at this stage, so you have some key concepts, but I think it's important just to understand the nuances between the different government departments involved and the different phraseology, as that will help you in your path to remaining in Ireland if that's what you choose. I'm then going to go through an overview of the graduate and student permissions so that you know the permission that you either have or will soon have, what you can and can't do under those permissions. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about employment permits and stamp 4, so that you understand that is as probably the next in the pathway to immigration in Ireland, and I think that's one of the main things that hopefully you'll be able to take away from today. And then I have some immigration tips for graduates and the frequently asked questions bit at the end to go through. So with regards just an introduction and an overview, I wanted to start by something that I think is quite important and is easy to forget sometimes. Ireland needs graduates. We've been at full employment now for quite some time. There's a huge student population that are coming from outside of the European Union, as Catherine and others have said, and that's only probably going to continue. And we've gone through a remarkable growth journey in Ireland over the last, certainly in the last 7 years since I've started working directly for servicing clients in the country. I often say Fragomen's growth in Ireland has sort of mimicked what we've seen with regards to immigration growth in the country, in that we started off 7 years ago with, maybe 15 people coming over from a London setup previously, and we're now over 100 people here working exclusively on Irish immigration for our clients. So there's a huge amount of need for individuals to come into Ireland to meet the significant gap of talent gap that there is. And Ireland has obviously grown significantly in regards to the amount of international students that have come here. And there have been pathways created for individuals coming from abroad to come live and work here long term. And so oftentimes I would be faced with individuals who have gone through the visa process of getting here and getting their IRP cards, their residence cards, and settling down, and then maybe going through the process of trying to find graduate employment and are faced with some challenges. I suppose my hope today is to try and give everybody a little bit of confidence around what we're seeing on the ground here, and what you might not always necessarily get to see that from an individual recruiter. We know that there are many employers in the country that are looking for talent, no matter where they're from, Ireland or further afield. We need graduates and we need talent to help fill the pipeline of roles that are coming into the country. And so you can see even on the right hand side there of the graph, employment permits took a very sharp dip after the crash of the global economic downturn and the crash of the Celtic Tiger, but is on a very significant trajectory back upwards. And again, this year is going to be another significant year of growth for employment permits issued to non-EEA nationals. So we're continuing to see that trend go in a positive direction for employers employers and indeed for you on this call. So I do want to start with that sort of hopeful note that to sort of show you that there is still pathways for graduates in Ireland, and hopefully this presentation will give you a little bit more information about how you can go into conversations with employers about your own immigration journey. To do that, I want to start with some key terminology. And I suppose to understand Irish immigration, there's kind of three key elements to it. And you know, I think the phraseology can be quite important so that you know what you're talking about. We have employment permit, visa, and Irish residence permit or IRP card. When we talk about immigration in Ireland, sometimes it's loosely referred to as the visa process. The visa is a very specific thing, which I'll talk about, but the visa process, in fact, is only one very small element of what is a wider Irish immigration piece of knowledge that people generally need to be observant of. The first one is the employment permit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what an employment permit is and the different kinds of employment permits that there are. But an employment permit is a permission to work in Ireland for non-EEA nationals, and that's the piece that we certainly in Fragomen deal a lot with, and I think what a lot of graduates will be potentially looking towards in the future. But that's what an employment permit is. It's effectively your permission to work in Ireland. A visa, on the other hand, is actually just an entry visa and is just a permission to enter Ireland for non-EEA nationals from visa required countries. So not even everybody in coming to Ireland requires a visa. There countries such as India, China, excuse me, the Philippines, Turkey, these are the kind of countries that typically require visas, and those individuals may be very familiar with the visa process. Indeed, anyone who's in Ireland and on this call right now or watching the video back is very familiar with the visa process, because in order to get to Ireland, they needed to get a visa. Whereas if you're American or Canadian or Australian, you might never have even heard of what a visa is for Ireland, because those are the nationals from countries that don't require an entry visa. So the visa piece is literally just to get you on the plane. It's normally applied for on the back of an employment permit or another reason to be coming to the country, and so that's what a visa is, and that's all that really is required to be considering at the moment. Everyone who stays in Ireland for longer than 3 months, however, will be familiar with an IRP card or Irish residence permit, and that's your permission to reside in Ireland. And that is for non-EEA nationals, and anyone who's coming for longer than 3 months will ultimately need to register with their local immigration office in Dundalk. That would be for those resident in Louth and surrounding counties. That would typically be done in Dundalk when they arrive at the local Garda at the head Garda station HQ in Dundalk, and that's ultimately giving you the permission to remain in the country. So if you're here as a student, you'll get a certain stamp type that's associated with it. If you're here on work, you'll get a different stamp type, and I'll talk a little bit more about the stamps in a little while, because that can be a little bit tricky. But ultimately, the IRP card is your permission to reside, and some people are actually able to work on the back of just their IRP card. So, for example, stamp 4 holders will be able to work without an employment permit because they have a stamp 4 on their IRP card. Again, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but I think the key terminology to take away from this is employment permit is your permission to work, visa is just your permission to enter, and IRP card is your permission to reside in Ireland. And those are kind of the three key documents in Irish immigration. There are two government agencies involved in Irish immigration as well, and I think that's important, an important distinction to make, and can be confusing. Okay, for us in Fragomen, typically the main one that we deal with is the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, or DETI as we know it. What they do is they issue employment permits for individuals wanting to work for an Irish company based in Ireland. Okay, so they really just deal with what we call sort of the sponsored employee scenarios only. They're quite specific to that particular remit, and so anytime anyone is looking to do any sort of wider immigration piece, it might not necessarily be to do with employment permits. But the Department of Enterprise are quite enterprise focused, and so have quite an efficient system. And what they typically decide on is eligibility and requirements for specifically allowing people to work in certain roles. Okay, so you might have heard of critical skills list, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. You might hear about salary thresholds and what's eligible to apply for an employment permit, and indeed they manage certain employment permit quotas as well. So they're very focused on work, which makes it great for us because they're quite efficient and they're quite good at it. But also that's just one element of perhaps a wider immigration process that not necessarily everybody will engage with if you don't need an employment permit. Anyone who's coming to Ireland for longer than 3 months, and indeed even shorter in some instances, will be dealing with immigration service delivery, which is part of the Department of Justice. Okay, so what they're set up for is the general immigration policy and enforcement, and so they do deal with all non-EEA or non-UK or non-Swiss citizens in one way, shape, or form. Okay, even if it's just meeting people at the border coming in on a holiday to Ireland, or indeed if you're planning to stay and become a citizen, that's where immigration service delivery come in. So their remit is much broader. Okay, ultimately one of the main things that they do is they have the right to grant or refuse or renew all immigration permissions or your IRP cards. So people now will know, anyone who's been here a while and they're on their stamp 2 permission for their residence card, they'll know that they've had to renew their card every typically every 12 months, because they're staying on their progressing through their student careers. That will generally be done either through the Immigration Bureau, which is what it was managed by An Garda Síochána outside of Dublin for quite a while. And now for everyone who's living all over the country, if they want to renew, they can do that online through the Immigration Service Delivery online platform. So they manage all that immigration renewal for your residence card, and that's one of the key things that they do. They also manage entry visas for those who require them. As I said earlier, the entry visa is just a document to get you into the country, but they help manage that through embassies and consulates around the world, as well as looking at some in Ireland as well. They have some other permissions that they work with, atypical working scheme, which you wouldn't come across all that often. International protection, they manage that, and that's obviously a very big piece of what they do. They look after even some investor visas and stuff like that, and citizenship as well. They look after all the citizenship pieces as well, and ultimately they issue all the IRP cards out of Dublin through their registration office here on Burkey, just by the River Liffey there. So in order to understand Irish immigration in totality, it's not perhaps as efficient as it could be, because it's in many instances you're dealing with two government agencies. They do talk to each other, but perhaps not as well as we would like, and perhaps we would like them to be a tiny bit more cohesive. But it is what it is, and a good way to look at it is the Department of Enterprise look at all the work permits and employment permit piece and try to manage that quite efficiently, and Justice kind of look after everything else, and one can sometimes feed into the other, in that if someone has an employment permit, they will ultimately move on to Justice to get their IRP card or their visa sorted as well. But sometimes not always the other way around. Sometimes you might only be working with the Department of Justice and never get an employment permit, and as a result, never necessarily need to engage with the enterprise. So those are basic sort of immigration terms to be aware of. I want to talk a little bit about just what graduate and student permissions are available at the moment, and what people need to be looking out for with regards to that kind of permission, so that they know what they can be doing and what they should and shouldn't be doing. Okay, I think many people on this call are probably on a stamp 2 at the moment, and that's your permission to study in a full-time course, as listed on the interim list of eligible programs, and it also allows for work in quote unquote casual employment. Sometimes it comes up the question, what is casual employment? It's not really defined, to be honest, in Irish immigration policy, and we'd often see a lot of employers hire people full time during the summer hours when they're allowed to do it, as sort of a pathway towards their ultimate employment permit or moving to a graduate permission. So work under casual circumstances is allowed, as long as you fit under the requirements for a stamp 2, and there's a very significant list on the Irish immigration website for all the different lists of eligible programs that qualify for a stamp 2. Ultimately, some key things to remember with regards to those stamps is that for a stamp 2, you can stay for a maximum of 7 years, and then the work piece is the piece that comes up all the time. Work for 20 hours per week during school term, and work for 40 hours per week during holidays. Holidays are typically defined from June to September inclusive, and then the 15th of December to the 15th of January, whereas any time outside of that, you're expected to be in a as a student, and not necessarily working more than 20 hours a week. The reason being, I suppose, it's a student permission, so the reason individuals are expected and given the permission to be here is so that they can study in their course, and not necessarily coming here just so that they can work and not really attending class. That goes against the spirit of what the stamp 2 is really about. Important just to be mindful of the 7-year piece, just for anyone who's coming and wanting to do a full bachelor's degree and then moving on to a master's. That might be a couple of years, and then if they want to do a PhD, stamp 2s are technically only allowed traditionally for up to 7 years. There's a bit of a grace period there for certain different types of different types of study that's going on, but it is important just to be watching the clock with regards what you're allowed to do on a stamp 2 and how long you're allowed to be here. You can't perpetually remain on doing bachelor's degrees over and over again and continue to extend your stamp 2. It does ultimately reach an end point, and so just to be mindful of that one. A stamp 2A, I'm not too sure many people will actually have one of these on this call, but it's ultimately it's a permission to study full-time course, but that on full-time courses that are not on the interim list of eligible programs. So the main thing is that this might be done for individuals who are maybe on a semester abroad or on courses that are outside that ILEP list of programs, but ultimately the individuals on a stamp 2A are not allowed work. So it's just important to be mindful of that if you do have one of those stamp 2As, that you might not necessarily be allowed to be employed, and just to be aware of that yourself, and indeed your employer or potential employer should be aware of it, although not every employer is necessarily clued into Irish immigration like they should be. Then stamp 1G, I suppose that's one of the ones that many people will move on to afterwards. There's different kinds of stamp 1Gs, which I won't get into the nuances of it, but the stamp 1G that is most common is a permission that is given to graduates who are given time to look for employment, having completed a third level graduate program. Okay, all stamp 1Gs are given for an initial 12 months. Okay, and you'll hear people say, oh, I'm going to get a 2-year stamp 1G because I've completed a master's. Whilst that is probably the case, they're never going to, or the immigration tend not to give you more than 12 months at a time for those stamp 1G permissions. So everyone is given an initial stamp 12 months stamp 1G. Those who have completed a master's degree program that are eligible may also get a second 12 months if they haven't yet found appropriate graduate permission. Technically, if you have found appropriate graduate work, they expect individuals to move on to your employment permit within the first year if you're eligible, even if you're eligible for a second year. I haven't seen that in practice in quite some time though, and a lot of individuals where available, if they've completed a master's, they do look to get their second stamp 1G instead of moving to an employment permit. And one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, what's the benefits of waiting to get an employment permit against staying on your stamp 1G? I think I deal with it a little bit later, but I suppose staying on a stamp 1G allows you the right to work without being necessarily tied or sponsored by an employer. An employment permit does tie you to that individual role and company for a certain period of time. So some people might like the flexibility of having extra time on a stamp 1G and would prefer to, not necessarily commit to that particular role, whereas some people might prefer the stability of an employment permit that's going to say, all right, I've got my job now, I'm really happy here, and I want to work towards a stamp 4 or staying with this company for a little while longer. So it kind of depends on what you're interested in and what motivates you. But a stamp 1G might be eligible. You might be eligible for a second year on a stamp 1G if you complete a master's that qualifies. But otherwise, everyone that completes the roles that are given on the interim list of eligible programs are given that initial 12 months stamp 1G, and you can actually work for anyone, and you're relatively free agent, which gives you the pathway to ultimately potentially get an employment permit. With regards to eligibility and process, the stamp 1G is designed to allow non-EEA graduates to seek graduate level employment. And that's the whole point. And it is your pathway to an employment permit. And that's why it was created. The holder must hold a current stamp 2 in order to move to a stamp 1G. And they have to have been notified in writing of successful achievement of your award or degree. So sometimes that can create difficulties, especially if you have repeat exams or something like that and your stamp 2 is expiring. You might need a little bit more time on your student permission so that you actually get your results in time so that you can then ultimately move on to a stamp 1G. I think, and I hope, I want to believe that things have improved greatly since everyone is now able to apply online for their new IRP card. Not that long ago, especially individuals who are living in County Louth might notice that there was a queuing system that where you had to try and get an appointments at the Garda station to extend, and that was quite tricky. Anyone now who has an IRP card already and has already done the initial registration at the local Garda station or in Dublin or wherever they happen to live, they can now apply for the renewal online, and that should hopefully make that process of extending your permission a little bit more easy to do. But it's just about being mindful about timelines, and moving to a stamp 1G every year, kind of sort of the September to now time, can be a little bit tricky because you might be waiting on results, and your stamp 2 student permission might be expiring. So there's mechanisms in place that can ultimately help people extend for a few months while they wait for the results, or while they take their while they take their repeat exams or something like that. It's obviously, it can be quite a stressful time for individuals, but there are mechanisms in place that ultimately allow people to do that. And then ultimately, hopefully, you pass your exams or you get your results in time, and then you can apply for your stamp 1G and begin working, and indeed looking for work that might ultimately get you on your pathway to an employment permit. One thing to be mindful of, this is just a very visual graphic, especially as we come up to Christmas now. I think it's kind of important to be mindful of what can happen there, but just to sort of make it look at how what I think an immigration pathway can look like for graduates in a perfect world. Ultimately, the graduate is the holder of a stamp 1G or a stamp 1A, which is for accountants specifically, or a 2 or a 2A, and you hold that permission as a graduate. And what you're ultimately looking for is your job offer. You get your job offer from a great new company that you're delighted for, and you really love the job and you really want to stay there for a while. Ultimately, it becomes at that point a prudent time to think about getting an employment permit. The sooner the better, to be honest, because for you, that sort of gives you certainty. Indeed, many employers, even though someone might have a full year on their stamp 1G, they might just want that certainty as well. And together you might decide, look, this is great. I want to go to an unemployment permit. They want to give me an employment permit, and I'm eligible for an employment permit. I go through that process, and ultimately, happy days, they get approved, and you've now got your new critical skills or general employment permit sorted. From there, once you get that, you then move on to your renewing your IRP card. You'll already have a stamp 1G or a stamp 2 permission. You'll need to move that to a stamp 1, and the stamp 1 is specifically for employment permit holders. So you will get your new IRP card once you get your new employment permit. At that point, then you should be free to travel without any difficulty. You'll have your IRP card sorted. One thing the reason I put this in is because travel during immigration, when you're going through an immigration process, can get a little bit complicated, especially if your permission is expiring. So anytime you're looking to book travel, just be mindful of when your permit expires, when your residence card expires, or if you even have a valid visa or not, because traveling, especially as we're coming up to Christmas now, it can be particularly difficult to travel when there's an expiring permission in place. So I just want to sort of flag that as, if at all possible, you might want to, if you've got travel plans sorted, just think about what immigration permissions you have and when they expire, and what your travel plans are. And if you can move them well in advance, well before you're due to expire, or well after everything's expired and gives you time to renew everything, that's always a prudent thing to do, because ultimately you're going to be faced with border management. I have a smiling border management there officer that you might meet in Dublin Airport. I'm not always sure they're smiling, but they're not even smiling for me, and I have an Irish passport. But ultimately what you want is a smiling border manager, someone working at the border management agency in Dublin, because you want them to see your IRP card, see that it's valid and there's no issues. Also see maybe that you have an employment permit and it's valid and there's no issues, and should let you back into the country, no problem. I suppose when things are due to expire, or when things have expired, that's where traveling can get a little bit more tricky. And indeed, in Fragomen, unfortunately, we often hear about the bad times. I'm sure 99% of the time it's fine, but because of the nature that we're in, even just last week we had someone who didn't need a visa but wasn't being let on the plane because their IRP card had expired. They were just waiting for it to come in the post, but they weren't let on the plane, even though they should have been let on the plane, and we had to contact Ryanair, and it was a bit of a disaster. So these are the kind of things that can happen when a permission expires. So that's why it's always prudent to get everything sorted well in advance, or do get so that you're able to travel, or just plan your travel not around when you're due to expire. Just a little tip there. I probably jumped the shark with regards my be aware piece. Then one thing that we see very often is that students sometimes apply for an employment permit too close to the expiration of their student status. Not always the students or the graduate's fault. I hasten to add, it's not necessarily the fault of the individual. Sometimes the employer might be a bit slow getting together what they can. But I think it's important just to flag it that you do want to give yourself as much time as you can, especially even though you might have your stamp 1G for 6 months left and you want to sort of see how you get on. it's always good just to try and, I think, it might be a bit of a conservative approach, but good just to get out in front of any potential problems and do any type of employment permit or renewal applications as soon as you can to avoid any issues. It's also important as a student, especially, to know the restrictions around what you're allowed to do on your certain student permission. And indeed, if you're on a Stamp 1G, you know the restrictions around operating your own business or being self-employed. You don't want some sort of casual employment to get in the way of your long-term immigration goals. And sometimes working, 30 hours when, even though you're on a Stamp 2, that's the kind of thing that if found out can get in the way of ultimately getting employment permits and getting future IRP cards. So really, it's prudent to know the restrictions on your permissions so that you don't get in trouble, because I wouldn't assume your employer necessarily knows. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing that many employers are too familiar with all the time. So it's definitely good that you're aware of your own permission. And then the travel restrictions, as I said, always be aware of visa required versus non-visa required. If you have a visa and your IRP card can act as a visa once you get your IRP card. So just make sure that you have your IRP card always in date when traveling, so that you're going to have no issues coming back. And that's even the case for non-visa required nationals as well. You may never have heard of what a visa is. Ultimately, you want your residence card to be valid when you're re-entering the country, because that's what the guards or what the border are going to look for when they arrive in, is, do you have a right to reside here? And that's what they're going to check. Right. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about employment permits and Stamp 4, because I know this is kind of the key element of what people are really looking for. There's two main employment permits that I think are best to talk about, right? One is the general employment permit, and then this critical skills is kind of the next level up one that's important. With regards any employment permit for general and critical skills, ultimately you have to be employed on an Irish contract. So the company has to be operating in Ireland, and they have to give you an employment contract that's going to form part of the application. So you need to have that employment contract signed by you and your employer before any application for an employment permit is made. There are minimum annual remunerations required. That is €34,000 at the moment for a general employment permit. So if you've got a salary that's below €34,000 on a very specific types of roles, you're not going to get an employment permit. So that's one of the key numbers to look out for when you are looking for graduate employment, is to make sure that if you need an employment permit, you're going to want a salary close to that as possible. That was due to increase as of January, so literally next month now, to 39,000, but that has now been paused. That only got paused last week, I think. That's not to say it won't happen. It's just paused at the moment. So that's probably a good thing for employers, and indeed yourselves who are looking for employment. The threshold isn't due to increase right away. So 34,000 is the magic number. That might change. Unsure as to when it'll change, but that might change, and it's important just to be mindful of that when you're looking for roles, that is the sort of the entry level salary for getting an employment permit. There's no minimum education requirements necessarily for an employment permit, for a general employment permit, but the role itself may require one, so just to look out for there. What kind of roles can be on? Can you get a general employment permit for? All except what's on the ineligible occupation list. On the Department of Enterprise's website for the employment permit section, you'll see two lists: the critical skills list, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the ineligible occupation list. So any role on the ineligible occupation list means that you can't get an employment permit for it. Okay. Now, it's a very old school list, and there's some jobs there that you may never even consider are still jobs, but there are some kind of surprising ones there as well. So it's useful to have a quick look at that list if you can. As I said, it's on the employment permit section of the Department of Enterprise's website, and it's worth just having a quick look to see what roles are there, to see if a role you're applying for is there, you might not be able to get an employment permit. That list is shrinking because there's a need for, as I said in my earlier slides, there's a need for graduates, and there's a lot of different types of positions that would have been previously on the list for ineligible are now eligible for permits, but they might need a labour market needs test, which is the fourth bullet point there. There are exceptions for what a labour market needs, what needs a labour market needs test, but ultimately what that is an advertising period where the company who's looking for someone needs to advertise the role in certain areas for a month. They ultimately, if they can't find someone from Ireland or the EU that's able to fill that role, they then look for the exception, which is getting a general employment permit. So those opportunities do exist out there, and it's gotten a lot easier to do a labour market needs test. So employers shouldn't be intimidated, nor should you be intimidated by it, because it's one of those processes that's quite common actually around the world, and Ireland's gotten a little bit more modern around that. Your contract length needs to be 3 months. Your dependent family can work, but they have to wait 12 months to come to Ireland. So if there's anyone on the call who has family at home, a spouse or even children, and they get a general employment permit, ultimately they won't be able to come to Ireland until you've completed 12 months on that general employment permit. When they do come to Ireland, then they'll be able to get a permission to work if they want, but it's going to be at sort of 12-month buffer. If they're already in Ireland and you came together and you're studying together, they will be able to work on the back of you getting that general employment permit. So it's just a little thing to be mindful of. Your path then is towards a stamp 4, which I'll talk about, is 5 years on general employment permit, and then you can think about residency or citizenship. And the IRP card that you'll get is a stamp 1, because a stamp 1 is associated with employment permits. Critical skills, the one that everyone wants. So again, similar to the general employment permit, but it's slightly more difficult to get a critical skills because some of the thresholds and requirements are a little bit different. The first one is that the minimum salary threshold is 38,000, not 34,000. Okay, that was due to go to 44,000 in 2025, but that has also been paused, so that's a good thing. Okay. You do need a relevant degree for getting a critical skills employment permit, unless the salary is more than €64,000. If you make more than €64,000, ultimately there's a good chance that you will be able to get an employment permit, as long as it's not on the ineligible list. That's kind of the magic number for getting a critical skills. Now, obviously, graduates getting 64,000, if you can get it, then great, and go get that job. It wouldn't obviously be that common for many graduates. So really, what you need to be looking for then, if you want a critical skills, is salary is 38,000, and that the role is on the critical skills occupation list. And my next slide will go into that a little bit more. So you'll need a salary of 38,000 minimum. You'll need to have a relevant third level degree, and you'll need to have a role on the critical skills list. And what do we talk about when we say relevant? I would say if you're in IT engineering and you have a degree in English, that wouldn't be relevant. But if you had an IT degree, that would be relevant. So there's no necessary parameters around that, but common sense will kind of dictate what's relevant and what's not relevant. And an argument can be made for relevancy depending on the type of role. So those are kind of the main 3 criteria that you're going to need. You won't need the labour market needs test for critical skills. So that's one less thing to worry about. Your contract has to be at least 2 years in then. So if you get a 1-year contract, you can't get a critical skills, unfortunately. You can get a general employment permit, but not a critical skills. Dependent families, your spouse can travel and work right away on the basis of getting a critical skills as well. So that's another very popular benefit, especially for those abroad. And then the final big benefit is that your immigration path to a stamp 4 is only 2 years, not 5 years. So then after that, you can move to residency and citizenship. So getting to stamp 4 after 2 years is a really big benefit, because that gives you a bit more agency around where you can move and what you can do. Critical skills holders also get a stamp 1. Just a quick run through is what are some of the eligible occupations. Again, on the Department of Enterprise website, if you Google employment permit section and critical skills list, they'll have a list of all the different roles that are available. There's about 50 or 60, I want to say, maybe that's a bit much. What are they falling under? Typically under natural and social sciences, engineering professions, IT professions, health professionals, some business professionals like accountants, management consultants, and business project managers, architectural type roles, art director and animation backgrounds and design in 2D and 3D animation, that's in there as well. And then sort of business sales executives and international marketing experts and things like that. So it's quite broad. A lot of people on this call hopefully are studying in roles that are possibly moving towards positions that are in the critical skills eligible occupations list. I would encourage anyone to take a look at it, but if it's not on the critical skills list and it's not on the ineligible jobs list, that means it is eligible for a permit. It just might not be a critical skills. It could be a general employment permit. There's these roles are vague sometimes and they are open to interpretation. So I think it's worth not ruling anything out, and oftentimes you might need a professional to have a look at a job and see, can it fit into one of the critical skills eligible occupations, or indeed is it even eligible for an employment permit? And that's something we would obviously recommend. So what's a stamp 4 then? As we talked about a little bit, your pathway to a stamp 4. Ultimately, your stamp 4 is on your IRP card, and it's employment without the need for an employment permit, put relatively simply. It gives you flexibility in your employment, so you're not tied to your employer anymore. You can establish and operate a business in Ireland as on a stamp 4 holder. Your dependent family have rights, and it's your pathway to citizenship. So the stamp 4 is ultimately where individuals want to get to, because it's as close to a permanent residence as we have in Ireland, and that's the kind of thing that critical critical skills permit holders will get to after 2 years. General employment permit holders will take 5 years to get there, but can still get there. And once you get on the path of of any employment permit, it's not shouldn't be too difficult to keep going unless dramatic changes in immigration policy occur. So before I wrap up, I want to give a couple of immigration tips, and then I can take a look and see if any questions came in and I have a few FAQs that I can go through as well. What are the tips that I like to give to people? I suppose the fact that you're here today is a really good start, I think, for anyone who needs to understand more about their immigration needs, and doing research, I think, is really important. I know it can be quite intimidating and painful, and like having been an immigrant myself in another country, I can't tell you how much more confident I got when I understood a little bit about the immigration process. And hopefully today's presentation has given you at least a starting point with regards to that, and given you sort of key elements that you need to be mindful of. If you do some research, you'll actually be able to find employers that are actually issuing applying for and are being granted employment permits every day of every month of every year. Okay, on the employment permits website, there is a statistics page, and it lists every single company that's ever got an employment permit since, I want to say, 2010. So you can even see up to the month data with regards which companies are applying for employment permits all the time. It's under the statistics section of the employment permit section of the Department of Enterprise website. So you can click on a spreadsheet, it'll download it for your screen, and you'll see thousands of companies. Like there are literally thousands of companies that get employment permits every single year. So that's a good indicator of the companies that do it. And sometimes when you're talking to recruiters of these really, really big companies, I was only saying it to Catherine just before the call here, there might be a whole team dedicated to doing immigration for one company, but a recruiter that you face might not necessarily know that, or might not be comfortable dealing with immigration. So to have that sort of knowledge, to know who deals with immigration, what companies actually hire and sponsor people, I think is really, really useful. I might help target the kind of companies that you're interested in moving and working for. If they're not there, that doesn't mean, I'm sure, that they wouldn't do employment permits, but I think just knowing who actually gets employment permits is a really good start for anyone who feels like this is the pathway for them. Understanding your own immigration needs, I think, is really, really important, and being confident in your own immigration pathway, especially when it comes to interview. Like, I do permits every single day of the week. I don't think it's a big deal to get an employment permit. I hope that individuals who are on this call who want to get an employment permit don't think it's going to be that big a deal either. And to project that in an interview, I think, goes a really long way when you're talking to individuals, when you're confident about, yeah, I know my story. I know I have a stamp 1G. I can work for whoever I want for the next, 9, 10, 12 months, because that's how long my RPA card is. I might need an employment permit, but I know that there's this role is on the critical skills list. I know that the salary threshold, it meets the salary threshold. I'm willing to engage, if you're willing to engage with me on getting an employment permit. That kind of confidence, I think, will go a long way when talking to recruiters and indeed employers who might not be necessarily comfortable with the employment permit process. Because, as I said, there are literally thousands of employers in the country that do it. Okay, so that should give everyone confidence that the immigration system works, because it does. It works really well in Ireland. There's always problems, but the employment permit piece specifically is quite good and should be quite efficient for those who use it. An important tip, as I said, is be prepared. Just plan your travel carefully around your immigration permission, and it's really important to know processing times that might affect your immigration renewals, and make sure that you plan accordingly. That goes for travel. That goes for even when your own expiring, and you want to remain in Ireland, and you've got time running out on needing to get permits and stuff like that. It's just important to be prepared and just to act as soon as you can and as soon as you're comfortable in order to do so. And then seek help. I'm obviously in the industry. The likes of Fragomen work with companies all over the world. We even work we have a private client practice. So if someone wants to engage us privately, we have a small practice that can help with that as well. But don't be afraid to get help, and indeed be careful of applying for yourself. Individuals can apply for employment permits themselves, but it's a bit of misdirection, because it's not necessarily that easy to do, and indeed mistakes can be made, and that's where you might start to get into trouble. Okay, it's a tricky system. It sometimes looks easier than it is, but when problems arise, it might be a really good investment just to invest in a company, and it doesn't have to be Fragomen, it can be anyone, but invest in a reputable company that would be able to help you through the immigration process, because, as I said, it might be the best money you ever spend, because it might set you up on the pathway to permanent residency and citizenship. And if you get get it right from the beginning, it should naturally follow relatively straightforward. So it's just important to be mindful of that, and that's one piece of one piece of advice I think would be worthwhile. I'm going to finish on FAQs, and I see then we have a few more minutes that I might be able to take questions as well. So I'll just go through some of the main ones that might arise. One, I think I addressed it kind of earlier, is should I wait to get a stamp 1G? Should I wait to get a stamp 1G until I get a job offer? Sorry, that I worded that poorly, so I apologize. Some individuals don't want to get their stamp 1G until they know for sure. They want to maximize the amount of time that they have on their stamp 1G, and if they want to, if they have a student permission until next summer, they might not necessarily want to move straight to a stamp 1G and sort of take their time to survey the market until they get a job offer, and then they might want to decide, I'm going to stay on my stamp 1G for as long as I can, because I might hate the job and I might want to easily move. As I said before, that can be a risky strategy, but ultimately it's your decision. There's no right or wrong answer to it. Some people like the flexibility of the stamp 1G because you're not tied to an employer. Some people like to be tied to an employer and know, I've got this employment permit for 2 years and I know I've got my job sorted. There is an opportunity to move when you have an employment permit after 9 months. Once you've completed 9 months on your first employment permit, you can now much more easily transfer your employment permit to another employer, as long as the role is broadly similar. It depends on the permit type and the role that you're moving into. But once you've completed, you have to stay in that role on an employment permit for 9 months. Then you're able to move. Stamp 1G, you're free until you get an employment permit. So it's really personal preference, I think. Do you need to be present in Ireland to move from a stamp 2 to a stamp 1G? 100% yes. The temptation, and I'm sure it happens, and if it happens, I don't want to know about it, but when you are applying for your stamp 2 to a stamp 1G, you do that online now through the ISD online portal. At the beginning and at the end of the application, it says you are declaring that you are in the country when you're making this application. So please do ensure that you're in the country when you're making the application. Back before it was an online process, you had to be in the country because it was an in-person application. So I would be very, very wary of making an application outside of the country and declaring to Department of Justice otherwise, because that would be disingenuous and could affect your immigration pathway in the future. So please do make that application while you're in Ireland. Can I get more stamp 1G permissions if I do more masters or HDIPs? Excuse me. The answer there is no. You get one run at a stamp 1G. It's 12 months for certain degree courses and an extra 12 months if you do a master's or certain masters or HDIPs. You can't go work and then go back and do a master's and get another stamp 1G. Unfortunately, it's a one-time deal. Can I self-sponsor a critical skills employment permit, and how does it work? The answer to that question is technically yes. I'd be wary of doing it. Self-sponsorship doesn't mean that your employer isn't involved in the process. Indeed, your employer does need to sign off on the application. So, and that's where employers sometimes are like, oh no, we didn't get involved. The individual did it themselves. They have to be mindful, because they have to give you specifically, because you're going to be filing the application, some key corporate information so that they can show that they're a registered company and stuff like that. And a lot of companies, when they realize that, decide, oh, actually, I'm not that comfortable providing corporate information to someone who's not even maybe an employee yet. So technically the answer is yes, but just be careful is what I'm going to say. And make sure your employer knows, if they do want to do that and you want to do it, make sure your employer knows exactly what they need to give and exactly what they're signing, because they have to make a declaration and sign off on the application as well. If I get a permit with an employer, how long do I have to stay with them, and can I move around? I answered that briefly earlier. You have to stay with them initially for 9 months. That's just your first employer, and then you can transfer after that. So yes, you can move around once you've completed the initial 9-month period. And there's now a new mechanism for that the Department of Enterprise gave, which allowed individuals to make it easier to transfer to a different employer as long as the role is broadly the same, or indeed exactly the same. And the good thing about that is you don't need to pay the government filing fee a second time. Most government filing fees are €1,000 for an employment permit. But once you do it once and then you do the transfer piece, you won't have to pay, nor your employer won't have to pay that €1,000 a second or third time if you decide to transfer. So that's good news there. Can I go back from a permit, or can I go from a permit back to a graduate stamp 1G if I don't like my work? Unfortunately not. Once you move away from your stamp 1G, you don't get it back typically. So yeah, that's why it's important to, when you're committing to your stamp 1G, to know, or committing to your employment permit, to know that that's what you want, because once you give up your stamp 1G, you can't get it back. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick drink. Now, Final two questions. Is there a negative in changing job during my first year stamp 1G when it comes to renewing my card for a second year? No, there shouldn't be. Your stamp 1G allows you the opportunity to transfer and find appropriate graduate employment. If you haven't found that in your first year and you're eligible for a second year, there's no issue with you moving, or there shouldn't be any issue with you moving unless something significant happens from an immigration perspective. But no, that tends not to be asked, to be honest. And the final question we have is, do you have to complete 2 years on a stamp 1G before you can move to a critical skills employment permit? The answer is no. You can move to a critical skills employment permit straight from a stamp 2 if you want. You don't ever have to get stamp 1G. And that's, again, comes down to your personal preference. If someone's willing to offer you a permit right from college, and that's what you want to do, or your employer says this is what we need you to do, there's no issues with doing that. Again, it just comes down to personal preference. Great. I was a little longer than I expected, but I'm on. I have a few more minutes, so I might stop sharing now because I'm not sure if there's anything in the chat, but I can't see if there is anything in the chat. So I might take a quick look here now, if that's okay. Sorry now.
Thanks a million, Colin. You take a bit of a breather there as well. Thanks for taking us through that fantastically informative piece there. There are some questions in the chat. I think you've answered some of them in relation to the frequently asked questions, but others are more specific. So I'm just going to stop recording now and give everybody